My own experience of a ghost occurred in 1998 in the particularly unspooky location of Manhattan's Upper West Side in New York City. I had traveled from the UK visiting friends of mine who had an apartment near to Central Park in a typical New York brownstone. For those unfamiliar with brownstones, these are the ubiquitous four-story houses built around the turn of the century in what was then Manhattan's suburbs to house the large families of the New York middle classes and their servants. By the 1950s, these had almost all been converted into apartments. My friend's apartment was a small one-bedroom affair 3 floors up. I slept on a sofa bed in their living room. The only window in the room had a roll-down blind, which was illuminated from outside by a street lamp that cast an orange light onto the blind. It was my first night in New York, and as I was still on UK time, I awoke, bright as a button, at 4 a.m. As I lay there wondering what to do for the next 4 hours, I noticed that something had obscured the light from the window. Looking up, I saw a dark silhouette sharply outlined and moving slowly across the window from left to right, with its arms raised above its head, rather like it was swinging on monkey bars. There was no drop in temperature or oppressive atmosphere in the room, and my first thought was that it was a burglar on the exterior fire escape. In order to deter anyone outside, I switched on the nearest lamp and read a book until the morning. The next day, I mentioned the cat burglar to my friends, who told me that there was no fire escape on the building. I then spent some time examining the window where I had seen the silhouette. Apart from no fire escape, there was also no exterior drain pipe on that wall, and the outside window ledge was no more than a couple of inches deep. The street lamp opposite was about 40 feet away and was not obscured by trees or anything that could cause a shadow like the one I had seen. 2 years later, I went to visit again, and on this occasion, my friends were hosting a farewell party for everyone in the block as they were about to move house. I mentioned my experience at the party, and was amazed to hear that almost everyone who lived there had seen a dark silhouette in their own apartments at some time. They all agreed that it was not threatening or even very frightening, and were quite proud of their live-in ghost. One of the neighbors had done a bit of research on the property and had discovered that the jazz singer Billie Holiday had lived in the building in the early 1950s, and was certain that it was Billie's ghost dancing through the house, although by that time the property was already apartments, and it seems unlikely to me that she would be interested in roaming the whole house. Let me start by saying that I've seen spirits everywhere I've lived, but I've never ever seen spirits like these. It took place around 2016 in Oklahoma City. I'm originally from California, and I packed mine and my children's bags and moved out to Oklahoma City to live with their dad, who moved out there with his mum. I had no family or friends that lived out there, so it was a huge change in my life. Oklahoma City was the most beautiful state I've ever seen. We were living in a 2-bedroom house that was perfect for us. Now, I usually know if there's any paranormal activity in the house, and when we moved in, I didn't feel anything at all. I was actually relieved that I finally moved in a house that was spirit-free. My daughter, who was 4 years old at the time, started to tell me about a guy named Robert. At first, I didn't really pay attention to her because I figured she was young, and kids her age make up imaginary friends. Every night, she would scream her head off and cry out to me. It would make me jump up and run to her room, and when I would go in there, she would cry and tell me that Robert was scaring her. I would have to lay with her until she fell asleep. There was a time I actually fell asleep in there with her, and I had a dream. I saw a huge black shadow standing outside their room in the doorway, and I heard it saying and asking me who I was. What was I doing in there? I wasn't allowed in there? I answered it and told it that I had every right to be in there. It belonged to my kids. I started to ask my daughter about Robert, because after that dream of mine, I started to think that this Robert business was something more frightening. I asked who Robert was, and she told me that he sometimes comes out of their closet at night. She told me that Robert was nice, and that he is always telling her not to be afraid of him, and that he wasn't there to hurt her, but to protect her. I asked what he looked like, and she said that he was a white man that was bald, and his clothes were very dirty. When she told me that he was there to protect her, I was a little confused, because why would she scream for me in the middle of the night, saying that Robert was scaring her? This started to happen almost every night, and I even told my husband at the time that I didn't want my kids sleeping in there because they were having nightmares. He told me that they're kids and they watch too many scary movies, so our poor kids had to sleep in that room. Every morning, I would wake up at 4 a.m. to make my husband's lunch, and one time when he went to work, I decided to stay awake and take a shower. While I was taking a shower, I clearly heard a male and a female yelling and arguing outside the bathroom door. I was so scared and spooked that I immediately turned the water off and stood in the shower to hear who the hell was in my house. It was dead quiet. I turned the water back on, and again I heard them. I started to think, okay, no one is in my house, and I'm hearing these people fighting. I have to be hearing things. My husband had to be at work at 5:30 a.m. in the morning, and there were times I stayed up and there were times I went back to sleep. The nights I would go back to sleep were the creepiest because I would lay in bed, tossing and turning for a while, and there was one time I heard our front door open and close, and I heard the person walking in the hallway and into our room. I'm thinking, oh, it's just my husband, forgetting something, and I'm ready to hear him. But then I heard a woman and a man talking. I was so scared because I was like, oh my gosh, they are robbing us. These people waited for my husband to leave to come inside and rob us. I was so terrified that I froze still. I didn't even want to breathe because I did not want them to know I was in the room. I hear like they started to look in our drawers and in the closet, and I was a little confused because it was pitch dark in our room. I mean, you could not see anything, and they didn't have flashlights. I was awake, and my eyes were wide open. Somehow I ended up falling asleep. And this was happening every time when my man left. There was one morning where I was somewhat awake, and I saw this bright light appear, and it lit up our entire room. I got so spooked that I sat up in bed, calling out to my husband, and he wasn't there, and I realized he's already gone to work. I quickly got up and turned on the lamp and just sat there, in bed, looking around. After that night, I slept with the lights on after he left. I still sleep with lights on. I have always been what you would call sensitive to things that most people have no awareness of. My mum would tell me that when I was young, I would be talking to someone in my room, or she would walk past and could hear me giggling as if playing with someone else. I don't recall much of that. But as I've gotten older, I'm 24 now, things have progressed, and now I'm wondering if I'm in some sort of danger. Even when I was young, I always hated walking in the dark, be it indoors or out, because I always felt as if someone were following me. That pit in the bottom of my stomach, the rise to my throat, and a cold chill that almost feels like a cold sweat breaks across my face. This still happens 3 to 4 times a week if I walk in the dark. Usually I'm pretty good about having some sort of light with me. Honestly, I'm not scared of the dark, just uncomfortable. The first direct experience I can recall was when I was about 19. I was sleeping at my parents' house, and I woke up because I thought someone had touched my face. I rolled over, and there was this small black figure on the corner of my bed near my face. It was shaped like a basketball, and about the same size. When I rolled over, it was briefly there. Then it jumped from my bed so hard that it pushed it into the headboard that I had lining the side of my bed. I screamed in terror. My parents ran in, but nothing was seen. My dad told me that I was just having a nightmare, but I knew I felt my whole bed move, and my headboard had items knocked off of it. I started having nightmares. Most of the time I couldn't remember exactly what they were about, but I would wake up extremely worried, with my heart racing, and usually in a deep sweat. For the most part, these were only a few times a month. I moved into my apartment in Elk Grove, California. I lived alone in my one-bedroom space, and for the most part, the community is very quiet. Like most people my age, my cell phone is never far from me. I would leave it on my nightstand, and often use it as my alarm to wake up in the mornings. Every time, and I mean every time, my alarm would go off while it was sitting on my nightstand. I would roll over to turn it off. When I roll over, I hear this gut-wrenching scream in my ear that sends chills down my spine. Each time, I would leap from my bed to turn the light switch. Now I sleep with my phone actually on my bed and no longer have the problem. When it goes off, I can grab it with no problems. When my good friend needed a place to live, I upgraded my apartment to a 2-bedroom so that she could stay in the other room. Since I moved, things have progressed much, much more. My roommate has a dog. The dog will often sit and stare at odd places of my room and sometimes the living room. When she comes into my room, she always stares at one particular corner towards the ceiling and growls. I've awoken numerous times with cold sweats and chills and even crying. Every couple of weeks I have strange marks appear on my body. They look like scratch marks but never break the skin. The most recent are a set of 2 approximately 2-inch long, very thin scratches on the front of my right shoulder. They almost look as if they're bruises. Any time that I've received these scratches, I've never felt myself get injured and have never done anything in the days close to the injuries to explain them. One day I came home and walked into my room. My closet light was on, which is very odd considering I did not go into my closet before I left. Then I went to my bathroom that is inside of my bedroom to take a shower. When I was in the shower, I decided I wanted to take a bubble bath. When I turned the water on, it went straight to shower head instead, which is weird in itself. After that, I laid down to go to sleep and heard something move near my bed. I assumed the dog had come into my room, since my room is usually the coolest in the house by about 7 to 10 degrees. Just as I was starting to doze off, my entire bed began to shake. I jumped out of my bed and ran towards the door and turned on the light. I realized then that my door was shut and the dog had not been in my room to make the noise. When I opened the door to come out, the dog was on the other side of it, growling and staring into my room. I asked my roommate if she had been in there or if anybody else may have, and she said no. I also tried to explain the light and the shower. I told her about my bed, and she stopped me in my tracks. She said that this weekend while I was out of town, she was in her room on her computer. She heard a banging and/or knocking sound coming from the rest of the house. She came out and saw nothing except the light coming from under my door. But I was gone, and no lights should have been on. She described the sound as if someone were jiggling the doorknob trying to open it. I've yet to walk back into my room. She won't go near it, and the dog, well, she is just lying between me and the door to my bedroom, staring at the door. At one point, she walked to the door and pressed her nose against it very hard and began snorting. She barked once, growled a little, then positioned herself between me and the door once again. From what I've read, ghosts are tied to locations and rarely to people, but at this point, I just have no explanations. I can't sleep in my own room, and at this point, don't know what to do next. I live in a 92-year-old house just outside of Chicago. We have lived there for 14 years now, and have had some strange stuff from time to time that would occur. At times, there would be years before something happened. The main area of activity seems to be our basement. My nephew was down there recently doing some work, and he got quite a scare. He had no fear, and I never told him any stories about activity in the house. He said he heard two people, a man and a woman, whispering to each other very close to him. He stopped working and just sat in silence and listened, and he could hear a conversation being whispered between two people. They were probably observing him and wondering what he was doing. When the whispering stopped, he felt his lower back get red hot, and that's when he sort of screamed and ran upstairs. He refused to go down there alone after, so I had to accompany him. My husband would sometimes sleep down there on a futon in the summer when it was too hot upstairs. He's a big guy and a former Marine and does not scare easily. One night at 2 a.m., I heard him pounded up the stairs really quickly. He said he heard two people talking behind him, and one he thought was a woman. He heard footsteps approaching his back and suddenly felt something pass right through him. He said it was an indescribable feeling, just like electricity from head to toe. Needless to say, he got out of there fast. I go down at night to do laundry and definitely look around a lot. I've so far never encountered or heard anything. Two of our dogs will never go down there, but our third dog goes down like nothing. I just don't understand if they come and go. But most of all, why would they hang around some old basement? Very strange. My first summer after high school, I worked for my neighbor. He had a contracting business that mainly did light remodels on houses, painting, general carpentry, basic landscaping, building decks, stuff like that. The usual crew was this guy, his partner, myself and one or two of my friends, and a general laborer or two, depending on the size of the job. About halfway through the summer, we got a job to do some cleanup on a house a few towns over which had been neglected for a while. Repaint inside and out, fix some squeaky floors and water damage, clean up the yard, etc. It was a decent-sized house and needed a ton of work, and the estimate was that it would take about a month to do it right. The homeowners had no problem, as they were not living there and were planning on selling the place. Everything inside had already been cleared out, for the most part. The first few days we spent just clearing brush and stuff out of the yards, so we could get equipment in to work on the exterior. Once that was done, we split off into two crews, one scraping the outside of the house, and one doing work on the inside. It was the summer, and the place did not have AC, so the easier job was the work outside, and we would rotate who was in and who was out. To give you an idea of the layout of the house, when you walked in the front door, you had large room off to your immediate right and left. Straight ahead of you and to your left, you had a staircase that went up to the second floor, to the right a small bathroom, and then straight back to the kitchen and another large room. Upstairs you had 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. There was only one staircase to the second floor. We started in the front rooms, and within an hour or so our radio started acting up. It was an older boombox type thing, with a manual cassette player and the knob with the slide for tuning the stations. In other words, it was all mechanical, not digital. At least 3 times the station changed on its own, from 102.7, which we were listening to other random stations. Sorry, no creepy oldies music or anything. What is interesting is when it changed stations, the station it would end up on would be perfectly tuned in, and the jump between stations was very quick, much quicker than a person could turn the knob and tune in the station so well and then get away from the radio without being noticed, like a second's time, just enough time for the slide to traverse the distance to the other station. No, the radio didn't have the mechanical station presets. At least twice, when this happened, I was in the room, and while my back was turned to it, the radio was in a location where it would have been damned near impossible for someone to get to it, turn the station, and then get out of there. It was not by a window either. On a few occasions, the volume would go way up beyond a point that I thought this thing was capable of producing. We then moved the radio to a different room, blaming it on bad power, and the problems let up. Other strange things. Lights would go on or off while you were working, including our own portable floodlights. It wasn't the power was cut or anything, but the actual switch was thrown. You could also hear footsteps above you when you were sure nobody was upstairs. The final kicker, as we were wrapping up the work on the place, I was replacing some molding in a second-floor bedroom. I had a large, heavy steel toolbox with a bunch of tools in it that must have weighed 30 or 40 pounds. One of those big craftsman jobs. I had finished off most of what I was doing and had most of my stuff put away when our lunch showed up. It was raining outside, so we're all sitting in the main entranceway by the stairs. In fact, myself and another guy were sitting on the stairs. Everyone was accounted for. By this point, we were all always joking around how we were working in a haunted house, due to all the strange stuff that was going on. But no one was taking it real seriously. Everyone was pretty much convinced that it was the combination of an old house, our imagination, and probably a few of us screwing around with each other causing the stuff. Mid-conversation about this, there was a giant crash from upstairs. One of the dudes freaked and just ran for the door. Myself and the dude sitting on the stairs next turned and went up the stairs. At the top of the stairs, you had a clear view of the entranceway to all of the rooms. So in the 3 seconds it took for us to climb them, nobody would be able to get out of a room without being spotted. Inside the room I had been working, my heavy metal toolbox had been tossed across the room, its contents scattered. The time from when it happened to when I got there was so short that stuff was still rolling around. Again, this was a 30 to 40 pound toolbox, which was sitting on the floor and had been clearly tossed a good 10 feet. We checked the other rooms and of course found nothing. To go out the window, which was closed as it was raining, would have been a 15-feet drop into some nasty bushes. No ladders were up on the house, or even off the truck for that matter that day, due to the rain. Everyone working there was sitting with us while we ate, and nobody could have gotten past us and down the stairs while we checked the rooms, as there were people watching the stairs. It was pretty damn scary, and the final couple of days of us working there, everyone was really on edge. Nobody would go into rooms alone, and you could tell everyone was pretty much scared shitless. The boss mentioned the goings-on to the homeowner, who was just kind of like, "Hey, whatever." A few years later, the place burned to the ground, and one of the guys I worked with that summer, who now lived in the town, sent me a story from the local paper. It turns out that the previous owner who lived there was a shut-in type person after his wife died a decade or so prior, didn't ever really come out much or do much, which explained the neglect. He had died about a year prior to us working on the house, but nobody found his body for at least 6 months. The people who had hired us was his estranged son's family, who had inherited the house and were trying to sell it. The house had changed hands a couple of times in the several years after we had worked on it, nobody ever staying very long, and it was growing a haunted legend in the town. In the interest of brevity, I left out some of the smaller parts of the story that were strange or could have been explained away easier, but suffice to say, some weird stuff was going on while we were there. I'm not one that really believes in ghosts or anything, but I have no way of explaining some of the stuff that happened there in any rational way. Thinking about it still gives me the chills. Nobody was aware of the story behind the house when we were working there, and you could tell after the toolbox incident everyone was truly on edge.